Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to Blade Runner 3, Replicant Night, by K.W. Jeter. Chapter 14. He woke up and wondered where the hell he was. For a moment, Deckard thought he was back in L.A., or that he'd never left it, and that everything that had happened anywhere else had been a dream. The kind you snap out of like falling off a cliff or the edge of one of the tallest buildings. Covered in night sweat, heart pounding inside your chest, fingers scrabbling at anything that would provide a second's hold. In an alley, he could tell that much, as full consciousness seeped back into his head. Narrow, cramped, and dark, at the bottom of thickly grimed and graffiti-scrawled walls with no windows. A damp cushion of rubble beneath him, moldering urban decay that had been swept or pushed or just blown by the wind into these forgotten dead-end niches. The sweet rank smell of garbage and other human cast-offs filled Deckard's nostrils. His own stink as well, as though he had been lying there for some undetermined amount of time. He ran a hand across his chin and found the stiff, short bristles of a 2-day beard. There had been an alley like this back in L.A., lots of them, most of which he'd been in during his Blade Runner days, often with an escaped replicant at the terminus, at that point where there was no place left to run, where all they had left was to press their spines against the building's steaming bricks and retrofitted exhaust shafts and wait for the shadowed figure to approach and lift the big black gun in his hand, aim and fire. That roar of light, the last thing their manufactured eyes would ever see. Deckard knew he didn't have a gun on him. He couldn't sense that weight tugging anywhere in his begrimed clothes, so he felt sure he hadn't fallen back into that soul-killing time. The outer Hollywood studios. He pushed himself up into a sitting position, scanning the area for more clues. Maybe he'd found himself in that perfectly reconstructed L.A., the Faw cityscape orbiting above Earth's brown atmosphere. A few seconds was enough to convince him otherwise. No extras, thought Deckard, looking out to the alley's mouth. So it couldn't be outer Hollywood. The money had always been spent there on a crowd of pedestrians, expertly gotten up like the real LA's packed and cultish street life. The area he could see now, out beyond this alley, was empty, at least for the time being. Hey buddy, let me help you with that. Deckard heard the voice at his ear, a ragged whispering sound, and felt the other's presence. Whoever it was, close enough to touch. My cop skills must be all shot to hell, he couldn't help thinking ruefully. He'd let somebody get right next to him without any instinctive defenses being triggered. A hand fumbled at the place where Deckard's own hands were crossed over the front of his jacket, holding on to some light object like a souvenir from his forgotten dreaming. It felt like thin metal, a box of some kind, light enough to be empty. His thumbs felt the ridge where the lid snapped tight. The other person's hands tugged at the little box, trying to slip it out from under Deckard's grasp. That pushed him to full awake. His eyes snapped all the way open, catching sight of a grizzled, cadaverous face close to his. One hand left the box and backhanded the stranger, knuckles spattering blood out of the gap-toothed mouth. Jeez, You didn't have to do that. The other man scuttled a few feet away and then crouched, wiping the red from his face, yellowed eyes sulkily watching Deckard. You want to be left alone? Just say so. The alley had to be on Mars, in the back reaches of the emigrant colony. The ineffectual roller had the twitching, jittery look of someone just starting to fall under the effects of acute stimulus deprivation. The skin under the rags and dirt seeped raw from the man's broken fingernails, plucking at his own flesh. Deckard drew himself up farther, leaning his back against the wall behind him. He looked down at the box in his hands, chipped white enamel on thin metal, with a faded red cross in the lid's center, and tried to remember what it signified. Inside his head, the blurred components of a dream moved toward each other, linking up one by one. Now I got it. A picture had formed, a little wrinkled face with weepy eyes. It grew clearer. Deckard saw the rest. Not a dream, but a memory. Not entirely real, but real enough. Something that had actually happened. A room with earthquake cracks running through the plaster, even across the high ceiling. The white dust sifting over toys and dolls, big ones, a frozen ballerina, and a fat, silently laughing clown. The faces of an aging child wasn't one of those, but a human's face, or what had been a human. Deckard corrected himself. Now, a deity in his own little pocket universe, which is where he'd just been, and from which he'd fallen out of. How long ago? Deckard reached over and grabbed the quivering man's thin wrist, pulling him closer. How long have I been here? Huh? The yellow eyes stared at him, stringy muscles jumped beneath the man's hollow cheeks. What are you talking about? His temper flared higher as he yanked the man right into his own face. How long have I been lying here in this alley? How should I know? Come on, fella. The paw-like hands shoved futilely at Deckard's chest. I don't. When did you first see me here? How long ago? Maybe yesterday. Yeah. The man gave a nod, vigorous enough to rattle his whole body. Yeah, there was a pile of stuff here when I went by, and that was yesterday. And then I came back to check it out. And it was you. Okay? So that's how long you've been here, since yesterday. Let go of me, will ya? Deckard released him with a hard thrust of his arm. Take a hike. The man scurried out toward the street, twitching slightly less from the input to his nervous system. A day at least, lying in this alley. Deckard shook his head, trying to clear out the last of the fog. Even without having been unconscious, his time sense was screwed up, an after effect of being in Sebastian's private universe. That was one of the well-known problems with getting involved with any of that dehydrated deity stuff. A true Rip Van Winkle syndrome, only in reverse. He had probably spent less than an hour of perceived time in there, and years could have gone by out here in the real world. No way of telling how much time had elapsed before he'd fallen into the alley's muck and trash. The rest of his memories coalesced, sharper than the indistinct images and forms left by dreams. He could recall everything that had happened, from the moment he'd found himself walking along Sebastian's recreated LA street, with the $1 million theaters neon glimmering off the rain-soaked pavement, all through the seismic fragility of the toy-stocked hideaway at the top of the Bradbury building. I lied to the poor bastard, thought Deckard. He was in no condition to start feeling guilty about it. All he'd been trying to do was buy a little more of that false world's time. Enough for Sebastian to tell him the big secrets. So he'd conned the genetic engineer turned small-scale god, handed him that line about Priss's being somewhere else at the fringes of that patched-together L.A., waiting for Sebastian to come find her. What a shuck. Maybe it was just as well that he dropped out of the pocket universe and back into this larger one before Sebastian had found out he'd been given the shaft again. The guy might have really gone to pieces, worse than just the building shaking into plaster atoms. Something else had been there that Deckard remembered. The little box, battered white metal with a red cross on the lid. Sebastian had forced it into Deckard's hands, pressing it on him, excitedly going on about how important it was. Deckard looked down at the object in his hands, the exact same one as he'd seen and held in the dehydrated DT's pocket universe. Makes no sense, he thought. The box looked like the container for some sort of regulation first aid kit. It even had clips on the back for mounting on a wall or in a cabinet. Ordinary enough, but it didn't belong here. It had been part of that other, smaller universe, the one that the transmogrified Sebastian had pulled together from the contents of his head. Everything Deckard had perceived there, from the snake-like glow of the theater marquee's neon shimmering on the empty wet sidewalk to the maniacal laughter of the clown mannequin, had its existence in that world. Not this one. Even the feel of the box's lid, both enamel smooth and rougher where the rusted metal was exposed. By rights, it should have stayed back there in Sebastian's illusory hideout. Deckard knew he should have woken up with hands empty, no matter what some tiny weathered god had tried to put in them. The temptation to throw the metal box away, just another encumbrance, when Deckard had enough on his mind already, rose in him. He could just pitch it onto the rest of the trash and junk that formed the alley's bottom strata, and not miss it. The box, first aid kit or whatever it was, or had been, felt virtually weightless. He gave it an experimental shake and heard some even smaller objects rattling around inside, prying the lid open. Deckard found a couple of small brown vials, antiseptic liquids that had dried up despite their seals, a plastic bottle of aspirin with nothing but white dust inside, a few once sterile bandages now suspiciously stained with age. A paper label had been inexpertly glued to the inside of the lid. If it had had instructions or words of medical advice, they had long since faded away. I should have let the guy have it, thought Deckard, instead of getting into a hassle with the twitchy, stim-deprived case who'd been trying to lift the little metal box from him. Then it would have been his problem about what to do with it. Deckard cocked his wrist, preparing to flip the ancient first aid kit into the farther reaches of the alley, then hesitated. For some reason, Sebastian had wanted him to have it, had hurried to shove it into his hands when the pocket universe had started to fade away. And the box had come with him when Deckard had fallen back into this world. If nothing else, it made for a strange, sad remembrance of the age-wrinkled figure and his retinue of somber toys. He tucked the box into his jacket pocket and stood up. The empty vials rattled against the metal, an erratic, hollow rhythm as Deckard headed for the colony's streets that had people in them. cop instincts shifting to criminal if anybody was looking for him. It would be easier to hide in a crowd than out in the open. The door of the hovel was unlocked. The knob turned in his hand without resistance. It had taken him another half hour, pushing and shoving his way head down through the thickest part of the milling pack to get to the Neiman residence. The last dozen or so yards, where there had been no one about except for a few total burn-outs rooting blindly through the accumulated debris, had been the most nervous-making for him. He knew that if any kind of trap had been laid, it would be right here on his own front step. The old instincts, hard to root out as the sinews along his bones, had again moved his fingers under his jacket, searching for the gun he'd carried in his other life. His hand came out as empty as it had on the neon-lit street of Sebastian's private universe. Darkness inside. He pushed the door open, enough to reach in and flip the switch on the wall. In the hovel's cramped spaces, everything looked as it had before he'd left. Minus himself, sitting at the table, slumped unconscious. The briefcase was still there. Handle turned toward the door. He could see his initials on the small metal plate beneath, and the various paraphernalia, the graduated beaker and glass rod, the packet torn open with a few granules of the white powder spilled out, the spoon from the kitchen area, a tableau that might have been of more interest to a drug enforcement agency if any had stuck their heads inside the hovel. He shut the door behind himself. As soon as he knew there was someone else there with him. He could sense the minute disturbance in the trapped air, different from the leakage through the ceilings and walls as multiple patches and caulking. Deckard halted, listening, hearing nothing, then stepped quickly around the table, taking the couple of paces to the bedroom door and shoving it open. "Mr. Neiman, thank goodness you're home," the calendar on the wall spoke in its fluty, overexcited voice. "Terrible things have happened while you were away. Murder and ruin." Deckard ignored the calendar. In the fall of light from the room behind him, he saw a figure lying on the bed. Smoke from a strong tobacco, more expensive than anything available in the colony's black market, drifted as a thin gray wraith to his nostrils. The figure on the bed brought the cigarette to her lips and inhaled. The small glow of fire drew the familiar angles and shadows of Sarah Tyrell's face. She didn't even bother to look at him, but went on gazing abstractedly up at the water-stained ceiling. Her dark hair unbound and spread across the pillow. "You're home," said Deckard. He sat down on the edge of the bed. "Where'd you go?" "Far, far away." Ash drifted, unnoticed by her, across the back of her hand and onto the blanket. "You'd be amazed, probably, if you knew." "Probably so." He let his shoulders slump forward, his forearms against his knees. Tiredness stepping along the chain of his bowed spine. The clock on the little bedside table was gone, its metal and plastic bits scattered outside. No great loss. He'd hated the clock and its idiot chatter as much as Sarah had. Clockless and shadowed, the room seemed to exist outside of time. From the corner of his eye, he could see her without effort. Overlays of memory slid beneath the thinning smoke. They looked so much alike. This face and that other, identical as Eldon Tyrell had meant for them to be. He had no need to close his eyes in this darkness. He could see the other one, the one he'd loved, the dead one. Deckard had to make a dead thing out of himself. Something without desire to keep from lying down beside her. Taking her in his arms, bringing his face to hers, smoke and kiss and the presence of her body, alive and real and an illusion. He wouldn't have cared. The calendar on the wall sensed the deep reverie into which he had fallen. "Mr. Niemand," it whispered, as though fearful of intruding, "there's something you should know." He didn't look up from his own hands dangling empty before him. A slow nod and sigh. "What's that?" "There's somebody else here. I mean, besides you and Mrs. Niemand." Deckard raised his head, taking a slow scan across the room. He stopped when he encountered another pair of eyes gazing back at him. "Who are you?" A little girl, with dark hair drawn back into a braid, regarded him somberly. "Don't you know?" She sat on one of the chairs from the kitchen area table that had been dragged into the bedroom's corner. The girl tossed her head so that the braid fell across one shoulder. "She knows." He looked over at Sarah lying on the bed. "What the hell's going on? Who's this?" "Oh, for Christ's sake." Sarah emitted a groan of disgust. She kneaded her brow with one hand. "Don't you start with that." Pushing herself up against the wall behind the bed, she fixed an angry glare upon him. "You know there isn't anyone there. Don't pretend you see someone." For a moment longer, Deckard gazed into the dark centers of the woman's eyes, then turned back toward the presence in the room. The girl shrugged and shook her head. "That's the way she's been thinking. She didn't believe those other two men either when they said they saw me." The girl lifted her chin in obstinate defiance. "She doesn't think I'm real, but I am." Deckard nodded. "She has her little ways." He looked back at Sarah. "Where'd she come from? Why did you bring her here?" "Now I'm really pissed off." In swift, angry motion, Sarah swung her legs over the side of the table. She jabbed her cigarette out against the table as if she could drive it through the imitation wood like a nail. "You know goddamn well where she comes from. She comes from whatever weird little scheme you and those die-hard Tyrell Corporation loyalists must have cooked up together. I don't know what kind of twisted gaslight agenda you people thought you could get rolling." She turned a fierce, annihilating glare upon him. "Maybe you wanted to drive me even crazier than I already am. Though why you'd want to bother is beyond me. I'm already at the limit." Her words came through gritted teeth. "I can see her, but I'm supposed to. She's my hallucination." He resisted the temptation to go over and grab Sarah by both shoulders and rock some sense into her. "Look," said Deckard, setting a hand flat on the bed. "I'm not going to go into details right now, but I just came from some place that doesn't exist. Not the way that real things exist, so I know the difference. There's a girl sitting in this room with us, and I want to know what she's doing here. That's all." The radiation that lasered out from beneath Sarah's eyelids went up another notch in lethality. "Fuck you, Deckard!" She stood up and strode past him, out to the front part of the hovel. "All right." Every encounter with Sarah Tyrell left him feeling exhausted, not the least of which came from the cognitive warpage of seeing the face of the woman he loved looking back at him with utter contempt and hatred. He leaned forward and placed his hand gently on top of the little girl's. "So you'll have to tell me. What's your name?" "You know." "No, I don't." Deckard tried to smile as gently as possible. "I really don't." "I'm Rachel." She looked straight back into his eyes. "My name's Rachel." He felt the room go still around him, around the two of them, himself and the grave, dark-haired little girl. A moment of stopped time, as though the world itself had held its breath, caught the way his was, next to his heart. "Is this some kind of joke?" He spoke without anger. All harshness filtered out of his voice. The child's hand, a thing of warmth and flesh and skin, was tangible beneath his palm. "I won't be mad. I won't be mad at you, if it is. Did somebody tell you to say that?" "Of course not." She looked offended. "It's my name. It's my real name." A pitying expression came into her eyes. "I don't have any other." The calendar on the wall rustled its pages. "I don't think she's lying, Mr. Niemand." "No, I don't think she is either." He didn't look up at the calendar and its photogenic scene of a vanished wilderness. "That's not the problem." Deckard's gaze was still held by the unblinking regard of the child. Sometimes people lied and sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they simply believed things that weren't true. "What's your last name?" She shook her head, the thick, dark braid swinging behind her. "I don't know. Nobody ever told me that." "Who are your parents?" A cloud passed behind her eyes. "They're dead. They've been dead a long, long time." Around them, in the silent room, the world outside the hovel's thinly fabricated walls, time had started up again. Deckard could feel his heart once more moving through its paces. Something had happened. He knew. A door had opened to some other time, and this child had stepped through. "It's her," thought Deckard. "She's not lying. Rachel." He could see it in the child's face, in the darkness of her hair, bound behind her, in the open, unashamed eyes, in the calm self-possession that radiated through every posture and motion of the small frame. He had loved, kissed, and held in his embrace, slept with an adult Rachel. If a replicant that would live only 4 years total could be called an adult, she had been created that way. Her childhood, a false memory stolen from the human woman Sarah Tyrell and implanted inside her head. He had never seen Rachel as a child except for a moment, a dehydrated slice of time, in the photos that she had brought to his apartment, that she had shown to him in a futile attempt to prove that she was human. Those had been photos of Sarah. He knew, or else total fabrications. Bad faith evidence concocted in Eldon Tyrell's workshops, as phony as the ones that the replicant Kowalski had been obsessed with. There was no need for Deckard to have seen those old photographs, the ones that the adult Rachel's trembling hand had thrust toward him, to recognize the child now sitting a few feet away. He could have closed his eyes or kept the room in absolute darkness, not even seen the child's eyes and face. and he would have known that Rachel, not the woman he'd loved as a woman, but some aspect of her, was there with him. From his own memory, Deckard pulled up another question to ask the child, something that he'd been told, reminded of, in the Van Nuys Pet Hospital, that sanctuary for escaped replicants, where Isidore busied himself converting them into creatures that could pass for fully human. There had been another photo there, an old news clipping on the wall of Isidore's office, that he had looked at and wondered about, because the woman in that ancient photo had looked so much like Rachel. "Tell me something." He leaned forward, bringing his gaze level and just inches away from the little girl's eyes. "Was your mother's name Ruth?" The girl's face lit up. "Yes, it was." She did a quick, excited bounce in the chair. "That's what the nanny told me her name was. It was Ruth." He angled his head to one side. "What nanny?" "Well, not like a proper nanny, like in the storybooks and videos." The child named Rachel gave an embarrassed shrug. "That was real. Not like me and you. It was just the computer and the machines and stuff that took care of me, 'cause there weren't any real people, at least until she came along." The child gestured toward the door and Sarah in the hovel's other room. "There were just ghosts and things that looked like people. They were all dead, though. So the nanny had to tell me all about stuff." She looked closer at him. "Do you understand?" "Sure," Deckard nodded. He had an idea of what she was talking about. "This place, with the nanny and the ghosts, did it have a name? Was it called the Salander 3? "That's it!" The little girl looked excited and pleased, as though finding herself on another human being's wavelength. She suddenly looked puzzled, forehead creasing. "How do you know that? You weren't there." "Oh, I know all sorts of things." More flashes from the time he'd spent with Isidore, and even before that, rummaging through what was left of the LAPD's ancient files on the Tyrell Corporation. There had been all sorts of fragmentary data, bits and pieces, transferred one way or another into the personal memory bank he carried around inside his head. "The problem isn't knowing things," mused Deckard. "It's understanding them. Like, how did this little girl come to be here? She didn't look to be more than 10 years old, if that, mixed of a somber adult quality, a wary regard of the things happening around her, and those kid reactions when he guessed her mother's name, made it hard to precisely fix her age." Deckard suspected that if he asked her that simple question, the reply would be that she didn't know. How could she? Something had gone wrong with the flow of time itself for the girl to exist at all. If she really was the daughter of Ruth Tyrell. He tried to remember the father's name, having to concentrate on the memory of the old newspaper clipping before coming up with the name Anson, the brother of Eldon Tyrell. If that was true, and right now he felt sure it was, then it meant that the girl had somehow been born after her parents had died on the Salander 3's aborted mission to the Proxima system. What did all the rest of it mean? Deckard tried to sort through the pieces as he studied the girl's face. He could see the other Rachel, the one she would grow up to be, already present there, as though an embryo, or more accurately, a flower that had only begun to show the color of its petals. No sexual feeling was triggered in him by the girl, though everything about her, the color of her eyes, the lift of chin and shape of cheekbone, even the barely perceptible fragrance of her dark hair, reminded him of the adult Rachel who had slept in his arms. A sadness tinged wonder, rather, at the girl's appearance. She could have been the child that Rachel and he would have had together if replicants could bear children. One more thing of which Eldon Tyrell had deprived them. But that was what the girl looked like, a convoluted genetic inheritance, yet breeding true from the smiling beauty of Ruth caught in the old news clipping photo. And how much farther back? Perhaps the woman that Anson Tyrell had married had tried to take with him to the stars, had been part of a long line of heartbreakers, not so much beautiful, though Rachel had been that, and Sarah Tyrell was, even now, as some other quality almost invisible, but still real, that laid a fingertip on men's hearts, stilling the pulse like a soft, effective bullet. She'll also be that way, thought Deckard as he looked at the child sitting in front of him, waiting for him to speak again. Not for me. For him, there would only be Rachel, the one he'd loved and had taken from him. For someone else. What's going to happen now? With the slightest tilt of her head, the Rachel child indicated the bedroom's doorway. A shadow passed through the light from the outer part of the hovel. She doesn't seem to like me very much. A note of worry sounded in the girl's voice. And I don't have anywhere else to go. I don't know my way around here like I did back home. Well, it'll be all right. Deckard squeezed the girl's hand. Nothing bad will happen to you, I promise. What a performance! The air temperature in the hovel seemed to drop several degrees as a bitterness-laden voice spoke from the doorway. Deckard looked up and saw Sarah standing there, leaning against the plastic doorframe, arms folded across her breasts. I really have to hand it to you. She slowly shook her head, her glare daggering straight into his eyes. Who would have thought you were such a consummate performer? I should have learned by now not to put anything past you. Uh-oh, the calendar, sensing trouble to come, whispered from behind its image of snow and trees. I don't think... Be quiet. Deckard hadn't taken his own gaze away from Sarah. What are you talking about? Your little show here? With a sharp flick of one hand, she gestured toward him and the girl. I could almost believe that you really do see her, the same as I can. He didn't feel like arguing the point with her any further. You went off planet, didn't you? You must have. That had to be the case, though Deckard had no idea yet of how it could have been accomplished. But the Salander 3, the interstellar transport upon which Ruth and Anson Tyrell had headed for the Proc system, wasn't here on Mars. If it existed anywhere, it would have to be back on Earth, sandbagged somewhere to keep the notoriously toxic effects of the old-style propulsion units from leaking out. Where did you go? Who took you? You sound like a cop, said Sarah disgustedly. Always ready for the interrogation, aren't you? Maybe you'd like to take me down to the station and slap me around a while. That'd probably seem like old times, wouldn't it? Oops, sorry. She held one hand up. I forgot. With Blade Runners, it's shoot first and don't even bother asking questions later, right? Knock it off. The needle of her words had gotten under his skin, as intended. Look, I went away. I came back, and you're not here. I go away again." That was what he figured his time in Sebastian's pocket universe amounted to. I come back, you're here. Great, whatever, but things have changed. There's a kid sitting right here. He pointed to the Rachel child. I see her and you see her. She's real. I don't want to hear any crap about hallucinations. I just want to know how you got to Earth, how you got into the Salander 3, wherever the hell it is now, and why you brought this girl back with you. His voice had hardened with his growing anger. How about that for right? Don't try to bully me, Deckard. With one hand, Sarah pushed herself away from the doorframe. She stood looking at him with her hands planted on her hips. I don't even want to talk to you, let alone listen to you. You're just making it easier for me to go through with what I've already decided to do. Not that I was going to find it hard to do it. A great weariness settled on Deckard's shoulders. His own fatigue meeting all the sense of lost hope and futility that Sarah Tyrell's mere presence evoked in him. A bad marriage, he thought, just as if the aliases of Mr. and Mrs. Neiman had been the names of real people. There had been a time when he had first taken Sarah from Earth, when he had believed he could accomplish something by welding his fate to hers. Even if it had been no more than moving her so far away from any sources of power that she could wreak no more harm to humans or replicants. But you can't fight crazy people, he told himself that once more. Something he had known from the beginning. They're always crazier than you are sane. When he looked into Sarah's eyes, past the memory image of the Rachel he'd loved, he saw the black hole of madness that could consume all reason and desire and life itself. A place that could give nothing back to the living, imploding as it were with the dense gravity of its own obsessions. He should have known. He had known that it was hopeless to fight against something like that. All right, he said, pulling his bent spine upright. Whatever it is you've set your mind on, go ahead. I've got other business to take care of. There was still the briefcase sitting on the hovel's table, the one that spoke with the voice of Roy Batty, and that had Isidore's list of disguised replicants encoded somewhere inside. Whatever else had happened in Sebastian's pocket universe, he'd at least been convinced of that much. Both Batty and the rep simps who'd put the dehydrated DT packet inside the briefcase had been right. He would believe Sebastian when he would believe no one else. Not because of the little genetic engineer's transmogrification, his new enhanced status as a small-scale god, but simply because Sebastian was incapable of lying. A nature as simple as his didn't change, from this world to any other. Deckard looked up at the woman in the doorway. I've got things to do. Sarah laughed. Like what? You don't need to know. Somehow, he had to find a way to carry the briefcase to the replicant insurgents out in the stars. Belief in the briefcase's contents and the acceptance of his mission were locked together for him now. He had no choice. The mission would have been hard enough to pull off, even if the UN were still sending new immigrants to its far colonies. but possible. The shutdown of the immigration program, the absolute bottleneck here on Mars, was compounded for him. They're looking for me, thought Deckard gloomily. The people who'd already killed Dave Holden, the first courier attached to the briefcase. They might be right outside the hovel, right now, watching and waiting. The only mystery being why they didn't just move in and ice him immediately. Maybe they were showboats, the breed of cops who like to kill in public, where everybody could see. That was the kind of display that could get someone promoted to the Blade Runner unit. He supposed that some grunt climbing to the ranks of the elite over his ventilated corpse would be an ironic justice, but one I want to avoid, Deckard reminded himself. What about me? The Rachel child spoke up, as though she had been able to read his milling thoughts. You said. You promised. That's right, sweetheart. I promised. And now this complication. Whatever he had to pull off to ferry the briefcase and Isidore's data to the insurgents, it would have to be done with the little girl in tow. And I don't even know where she came from or how she got here. Still, I'm not leaving you behind. True, said Sarah from the room's doorway. That's because you're not going anywhere, Deckard. That's what I came back here to tell you. He looked back around at her, but another voice broke in before he could speak. Mr. Neiman, be careful, said the wall calendar. She's got a gun. A new one. The calendar was telling the truth. The evidence was in Sarah's hand, pulled from her coat pocket. The black metal hung suspended a short distance from Deckard's face. The muzzle's hole looked as deep and dark and fatal as the centers of the woman's eyes. He allowed one eyebrow to rise. That's what it's come to? Deckard was really only surprised that it had taken this long. Oh, it's always been this way. Sarah's gun hand displayed no wavering. I just didn't know it until recently. Well, it's always good to know what you want. Right now, he wanted to keep her talking while he figured out what to do. She knew how to use the gun. He was aware that she could pull the trigger without flinching. No chance for making a sudden grab for the weapon. Sarah stood a carefully judged distance from him, just far enough away that a quick lunge was out of the question, especially from his sitting position, and just close enough that she could unload the gun's clip right into his chest, grouping the entrance holes into a pattern tight as her fist. So, a trickle of sweat ran down one side of his neck. What finally decided you? Sarah tilted her head back, keeping her narrow gaze and the gun aimed at him. This little act of yours, this thing you've cooked up with the Shadow Corporation, the die-hard Tyrell Corporation loyalists. I don't know what you're talking about. What Shadow Corporation? That's good, Deckard. That's real good. One corner of her mouth lifted in a humorless smile. You're a real professional, an actor. You're going to keep your part rolling right up to the very end. I'm not acting, he gave a shrug. I just don't know what the hell you're going on about. Deckard, there was probably a time when I would have believed you about that. A slow shake of the head. Her expression changed to one of sad regret. I would have liked to have believed you. It might have made things easier in some ways, but it's too late for that. A twitch of the gun's muzzle indicated the little girl across from him. This business, this performance of sitting here and talking and acting as if you can see somebody else here with us. A child who says her name is Rachel. She took a deep breath and expelled it through clenched teeth and an audible hiss. Those other two, Wycliffe and Zwingli, I bet you know their names. That was how they were going on as well before I took care of them, trying to make me think they could see my hallucinations, trying to make me think what I saw was real. You sons of bitches must have thought you were really being clever. Never heard of anybody named that, at least not outside the history books. Deckard spread his hands apart. Besides, even if these people, whoever they are, and I were in some big conspiracy against you, what would we accomplish by pretending we could see things that don't exist? I don't get it. Why should I try to figure it out? Perhaps you're just sick individuals. Sarah's face darkened with anger. Sicker when you put your heads together. Perhaps you're all just crazy. The same thin, ugly, non-smile appeared. Perhaps even as crazy as I am. He saw an opening. You think so? I'm not joking around now. Deckard kept his voice low and serious. But did you ever really consider that possibility? You know, that I might be as crazy as you are? And not just that, but crazy in the same way? Without saying anything, Sarah regarded him over the top of the gun. The muzzle dropped a 1/4 inch, no more. Think about it. Deckard pressed on, trying to expand the tiny fracture he'd created. Wouldn't I have to be? You know how contagious insanity is. It spreads from person to person, from you to me. After the things we've been through together, how could it be any other way? Shut up! The gun jerked back into position as Sarah visibly tensed. I don't want to listen to you. It's just another one of your con jobs. The stuff cops will say to get themselves out of a tight place. I just didn't think you'd be quite so good at it anymore. He decided to backtrack, to come at her from another angle. Work fast, he told himself. Even without a clock in the room, he knew that time was running out. The moment approaching when she would realize she had been stalled. The moment when she'd pull the gun's trigger. Tell me something, said Deckard. After you kill me, what are you going to do with her? He nodded toward the little girl across from him. Anything? Sarah gave a non-committal shrug. Hadn't thought about it. Perhaps I'll try shooting her as well. The Rachel child shrank back in the chair, her eyes wide and apprehensive. Doesn't seem like that would accomplish much if she's not even real. True, admitted Sarah, but it might get her out of my head. It doesn't matter anyway if it works or not, since I'm already planning on killing myself. That should do the trick. The hovel's bedroom had become a little world of madness, with Sarah as the gatekeeper, the black staff of her office weighing in one hand. For a moment, Deckard considered whether he might have spoken more truly than he'd intended. Maybe I am as crazy as her. A sure sign of that condition when you could talk calmly about death, about desiring and willing it, in a strange parody of rationality. What if I'm not conning you, though? Deckard kept himself still, unthreatening. I'm not in any conspiracy against you. I don't know these two men you've been talking about, and I can prove it. Really? A sneer passed across Sarah's face. How? You say I don't see her. He pointed a thumb toward the Rachel child. That I can't. She's a hallucination. Your hallucination. So ask her to tell you something. Sarah eyed him with suspicion for a moment, then glanced over at the girl. When we were inside the Salander 3, when I found you there, what was on the floor between us? That's easy, said the girl. There was a big pool of blood. It was so big you could see yourself in it, like a mirror. That's what you said. A big pool of blood, repeated Deckard. He looked up and caught Sarah's gaze, fastening tight upon it. It was so big you could see yourself in it, like a mirror. He spoke the words dryly, in a matter-of-fact tone. That's what you said. That's what the girl here just said. Impossible. Sarah's expression changed to one of puzzlement. You shouldn't have been able to hear her say that. She doesn't exist except in my head. But I did hear her. So she's in my head too, isn't she? The gun dropped lower as Sarah tried to figure out the puzzle. She's not real. She isn't really here. But you heard her. He was aware of the child watching them both. Maybe she's the only sane one here, thought Deckard. A genuine smile, one of realization, appeared on Sarah's face. Then you're right, she said. You are crazy, just like me. Just like you. With her free hand, Sarah rubbed one corner of her brow. That's so strange, you know? It comes as rather a relief. It's like when I went into the Salander 3 and I found her. She nodded toward the girl. I didn't feel quite so alone. It didn't matter whether she was real or not. You're not alone. Make her believe it. Deckard softened his voice, the way one would speak to a lover. You and I, we really are in this together, whether we wanted it to be that way or not. Is that true, Deckard? She gazed at him in wonder. Is it? He pulled something up from memory, his memory and hers. Do you know what you had me say a long time ago? Do you remember that? It was what you knew I'd said to her, that other Rachel. A slow nod as that tiny fragment of the past became clear to her once more. I wanted you to say those things to me, the way you'd said them to her. The past that had been his and Rachel's, that had become his and Sarah's. He spoke the words again. Do you trust me? Gun in hand, Sarah closed her eyes, hearing him this time, and in that other time, and in that time stolen from the woman he'd loved. I trust you, she said softly. Deckard knew he had her now. The gun still hung in the air between them, her finger on the black trigger's curve, but not for much longer. Say, I want you. More words from the past. Say it. I want you. He stood up and reached toward her, not to take the gun out of her trembling hand, but to take her in his arms, press her close to himself, the way he had taken Rachel and brought her lips to his, felt her heartbeat trip and accelerate in sync with his own. And this time the gun was caught between them, her hand trapped against his chest, the black metal like a second shared heart. One with no pulse, no time, nothing but the death they had both raced toward. Deckard kissed her, mwah, For that moment, she wasn't Sarah. She was Rachel. Memory, the past, madness, all folded around him, and he didn't care. He would have given anything, everything, for that moment to last. The woman in his arms, Sarah, Rachel, he wasn't sure which, yielded to him. Perhaps she didn't know which one she was, the living or the dead. Madness, thought Deckard as he drew her to the bed, his arm around her shoulders, sitting her down beside him at the mattress's edge. He brushed her dark, tousled hair away from her brow. Her face burned feverish as she leaned it into the cup of his palm. For a few seconds they were alone in the room, the other child forgotten. "You're right," whispered Sarah. "You're as crazy as I am, you poor bastard." He nodded. "There's not much we can do about it." Nothing, except she looked down at her hand, still gripping the gun resting in her lap. Except what I'd already decided to do. Her unmasked, desperate gaze searched for some sign in his eyes. "That's right, isn't it? That's what you want, don't you?" Deckard could almost feel sorry for her. Sure. When he looked back at her now, he saw only Sarah Tyrell. The woman he'd loved was dead, a long time ago. "That's what I want." I knew it. An odd, broken happiness sounded in her voice. I should have known it. "Tell you what," he squeezed her shoulder, bringing her closer into his side. "I'll do it. It's easy for me. You know that it is. I'll kill you, then I'll kill myself." He brought his head down to look straight into her eyes. "That'll work." A coy smile appeared. She looked up through her eyelashes at him. "I trust you, Deckard, but not that much. Besides, if I went first, then I wouldn't get to see you dead, and I wanted that too." "You can have whatever you want." Deckard brought his face closer to hers again. "You deserve it." As he kissed her, he brought his free hand between them onto hers, holding the gun. Her fingers had relaxed, loosening their grip on the cold metal, as he had hoped, known they would. In one swift arc, he grabbed the gun and pulled it away, sealing it in his own fist. The arc was completed when he leaned back from her, the gun's black weight swinging up and smashing across the angle of her chin. The impact rocked Sarah's head back, lifting her part way and throwing her back onto the bed, one empty hand reaching futilely toward him. "Come on!" Deckard stood up and grabbed the Rachel child's hand, yanking her to her feet. He shoved the gun inside his jacket. It produced a hollow clank of metal against metal, the blunt muzzle rapping on the ancient first aid kit that he had brought back with him from Sebastian's pocket universe. Ignoring the sound, he pulled the girl toward the door. "We're getting out of here!" "Mr. Niemand!" a voice shrilled from the wall. "Now's your chance!" The calendar's pages fluttered. "Don't just leave her! Kill her! Shoot her! She's a wicked person! She blew away the clock!" He was already reaching inside his jacket, his hand closing around the gun, as he looked back toward the figure on the bed. "It's right," his thoughts ran. "Don't be a fool. Do it." All he saw was the woman's tangle of dark hair, an angle of her face shadowed by both darkness and the overlay of his own memory. God damn. He shoved the gun deeper into his jacket. The chances were more than good. They were certain that he'd regret this. "Let's go." In the front part of the hovel, Deckard let go of the Rachel child's hand long enough to pop open the lid of the briefcase on the table. "What's going on?" asked Batty's voice. "I could hear you people talking." "Later," Deckard swept the Sebastian paraphernalia, the packet, and the other bits and pieces into the briefcase, then snapped it closed. Just shut up for now. Briefcase in one hand, leading the Rachel child with the other, he emerged from the hovel. No hail of gunfire met him. That's a good sign, thought Deckard wryly. He set off at a fast pace, carrying his burdens with him.